Thank you very much.
Absolutely, dear. I always feel sorry for the bookkeeper who receives my check. So we're going to get started in just another minute, see if anybody else joins us. And then we're going to turn it over to Scott. And this meeting is being recorded, and Scott is going to make these slides available for us at a later date.
Yeah, I can make that happen probably later today or tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Are we ready?
It is 10 after.
Let's get started.
I'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you so much, Scott.
As I lose my voice. Welcome.
Scott, do you want me to interrupt you if people ask questions?
No, I've got the chat window open. I'll see it. So I will absolutely see it. Okay, so welcome to Developing Relationships with Northern European Gods and Goddesses. I'm Scott Monker, and I'll be facilitating our discussion this week. I hope this will be not just me talking for the next, say, 60 or 90 minutes, because that'll be really dull. I want to hear people's experiences, what they're going through, what they're not going through, what they're thinking about. Please feel to chime in and share. You can either unmute yourself, wait for me to pause. I will pause briefly and go ahead and interrupt in, or put in the chat window, and I'll go ahead and read your question, and then I'll read my kind of immediate response for the question. If you do have a question that's off topic, I'm perfectly fine answering any kind of heathen related questions. We've already got one on queue already. I will put those off to the end, just so you know. So if it's not directly related to the topic, I'll put it off towards the end. And with that, let's get started. First of all, a little bit about me so people know where I'm coming from. Here's my nice COVID mask with the fire flame on it. I converted to heathenism from 1997. I actually come from 4 generations of Methodist ministers. The only one in my family who wasn't a Methodist minister was actually my father, who got out of seminary for some inappropriate dancing in the 1960s. And we'll just leave it at that. I've been teaching heathenism since 2000. It only took me about 3 years until people said, would you really teach a class in this? Would you really teach a class in this? And I've been teaching pretty much every year since 2000. So I'm coming up on year 21 now. Wow. I've taught at Free Spirit Gathering. I've taught at Sacred Space. I was going to teach at Hallowed Homecoming this fall, but they're delaying me till 2021 because of obviously of COVID. And I've taught for Blue Star at some of their stuff, a variety of different places. I've got 3 books out there. I put the links into the chat window. On Scott Monker on Amazon, you can pretty much find who I am. My primary work right now is with the Potomac Seither Guild Åndsvigshuller Seither Group, which is a Seith group devoted towards the oracular practice of Seith within the Northern European traditions. Oh, and Irene points out, oh yeah, I taught at Frederick Pagan Pride Day too, twice. I've actually taught there twice. I think I taught there twice. Maybe, yeah, twice. And so that's where my primary work is now, is with their oracular practice. I would normally tell people to introduce themselves, but I'm going to be perfectly honest, with 30 people in here, I don't want to take the next hour having everybody introduce themselves. My apologies. I always like to hear what people have to say, but with 30 people, I don't think I can do that. I always like to tell people, how do I pay my bills? Very few people, pagan, pay their bills being a pagan. I am a professional instructor. I teach network security for a living. I have for the last 11 years. And I teach in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and have gone all over the place teaching network security. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so let's start with the question of how do the Northern European gods come to us? How is it that someone is going about their normal everyday life and suddenly they're feeling drawn to a Northern European path? And I tend to think about this in terms of several different possibilities. And the first one is just, and that's what the left one is just a general heathen interest. You're at a pagan festival, you're somewhere and you meet the heathen community, and most heathen communities are very, very friendly and a lot of fun to be with. And so you start to gravitate towards just kind of, you know what, this heathenism thing is kind of cool. I kind of like the gods and I like what they're talking about. And you get drawn into kind of dealing with the Northern European gods along that way. So that's one way we kind of get drawn towards heathenism. Another one is as we're finding our path, we find ourselves on a specific, find ourselves having a specific interest in a specific deity. That deity may not be ultimately the deity we end up dealing with, but it's the one we start with. I've got Odin and Freya here as two classic examples here where we're going into heathenism and we say, wow, Odin's a really cool guy, or Thor's a really interesting person, I want to know about him, or Tyr, lawyers. I was a lawyer for a while. And so actually my path to heathenism did not start with Odin and Freya, it started with Tyr. And people would never call me a Tyr's man now. Not that I don't follow my oaths, but I'm definitely more of an Odin and Freya person instead of a Tyrsman. But I started on the Tyr path. So it may be that there's a specific god that kind of draws us into the pantheon. Now, one, I got one more coming in. The last one, and this is probably the talk when I'm doing counseling to people, and the one which is most challenging, and it's represented by this wonderful little item here, which is we have some kind of vision level experience that draws us to the northern gods. Now it can come in a variety of different ways. It can be a dream where you're regularly dreaming about Odin or Freya, or a lot of times they say, I'm dreaming about this person and he's in a blue hat and he has an eye patch on and I don't know what's going on, or I'm dreaming about this woman and she has two cats and she has wings. And I'm like, okay, well, we know where you're headed. Or we're dealing with a man who has a big honking hammer in his hand and he's always hitting stuff with it. So they can come to us through dreams. In some cases, if you're engaged in pagan ritual, you may have a visionary experience during ritual, particularly if you're involved in, can I disable the doorbell function? Hang on a second, let me see. Oh, it is off. You shut it off for me. Thank you.
I shut it off. Yeah. Sorry, Scott.
No problem.
I'm watching.
You may be in ritual and have some kind of experience, kind of a visionary level experience. This is particularly common if you go to any of the various transpossession rituals that you may encounter in the region. We do the oracular sage ritual. Utah's does their transpossession ritual. There are certainly other organizations that do their transpossessory rituals, and you may have a very close personal encounter with a divine, Northern European divine being that causes you to suddenly say, I've got to be on a Northern European path. It may be waking visions. I have talked to people that have waking visions that relate to dealing with a god or goddess of the god, Northern European god or goddess. Or the last one I'll use is they may be whispering in your ear. And that's kind of a weird one where you kind of get that inkling in your head where you're kind of like someone's talking to you in your head. And it's a god or goddess talking to you. Now it might be a sign of something more serious in terms of psychological condition, but it could also just be a god or goddess kind of tapping you on the shoulder. So these are the kind of the different ways that we see the Northern European gods come to us. My advice with respect to it is, because this is all about my personal experiences, is once one of these things happen, the worst thing you can possibly do is ignore it. The Northern European gods are not particularly good about being ignored. They won't make things bad for you. They will just be very persistent. I can't tell you the number of people who have come to me and said, well, if I ignore them, will they go away? And the answer is honestly no. With very few exceptions, when we're dealing with this particular pantheon, once for whatever reason they have chosen to come into your life, it is something you're going to have to address. Now, that doesn't mean you have to become heathen. It doesn't mean you suddenly have to become married to Thor or married to Odin or whatever it is, or married to Freya. It is, you have to deal with it on some level. I'm going to talk more about that, what that deal is in a little bit. So if you do encounter one of these, particularly if we're on this visionary side here, but even over here, once you start getting drawn down that path, it's ultimately something you want to make sure that you deal with at some level. And we'll talk about ways you can deal with in a little bit. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts, or so far? Anybody who's had experiences like that? I can't tell you the number of people that say, yeah, so-and-so came to me and I ignored them and they came harder and harder and harder and louder and louder and louder. And I said, well, maybe you ought to talk to them then. Do I have any questions, comments, thoughts?
Odin's a fun one.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah. Back before I was pagan, I was going through a very, very rough time of my life. And I had considered taking my own life. And the night that I was actually going to try, I'm sitting there. It's like, okay, I'm going over in my head, what are the reasons I should not do this? And the whole time I'm sitting there doing this, I felt this old man behind me. And I could almost see him. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what the hell this is. And then at one point he just said, so you're going to do it or not? Make up your goddamn mind. And obviously I chose not to. And in trying to figure out what the hell happened, I got a few more insights out of nowhere. And it's like, oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
No,
No,
that's what started it.
is a lot of these gods will come to you on kind of that initial contact point in what I refer to as a time of need, which is there's something that you need help with in your life, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means and how you deal with it. But God is seeing that, look, you're no longer able to cope, and they're there to help you through the process. That's very common. But yeah, definitely. Anybody else have any experience they'd like to share? Thoughts, comments? If not, that's okay.
Irene mentions that she was kidnapped.
Yes, Irene said she was kidnapped.
And I think Brielle said, somebody else said that.
Oh, so Brielle asked the question, does anyone else believe the movies, books, comics, musicals can be the God's way of reaching us, that people go from being drawn to character to the mythological figure to the deity ourselves? We are going to talk about exactly that concept in a little bit. And the concept behind it is he who is remembered lives. It's a very important heathen concept. And it's my belief that the modern incarnation of Marvel and the various other, I actually got a bunch of other books, like the guy who wrote the Percy, the Greek mythos in the modern times.
Percy Jackson, Rick Riordan,
Rick Riordan, yeah.
He has a Northern European set as well that are really good.
Those are probably my favorite book series of his, actually. He did a phenomenal job with them.
So that one, when I think on it, I think I was kidnapped too. So Ingrid said, I just realized in the past few months that a certain God has been trying to get my attention pretty much my whole life. I just realized now, hang on, I got to back up who it was. There you go. Yeah, Percy Jackson. Thank you. Yeah, I changed the original because of. Oh, Rick Riordan. Wow, Rick Riordan is a voice for change. Ragnarok on. I have not seen Ragnarok on Netflix yet. I'm a horrible heathen. I have not yet finished all of the Viking series yet, and I have not yet watched Ragnarok yet. I'm working on it. The Marvel Thor series, Ragnarok. Everybody says Ragnarok is fabulous. Yeah, Reardon's Hellenic stuff, if I were more drawn to the Hellenic, is absolutely wonderful. I'm just not, you can see me, I'm not built for the Hellenic physically. In addition, kind of emotionally, I'm not built for the Hellenic. American Gods, that's another, American Gods is a wonderful one. I hope they'll do a third season in American Gods, but I don't think they will. We'll see. Wow, lots of good stuff. Yeah, that's an interesting point, that this tapping to us isn't necessarily directly, but I hadn't thought about that. If you hit a movie or a book or something that really rings to you and you find yourself coming back to it again and again and again, that may be one of those gods coming to you. Okay, so let's talk about the next one. And this is probably particularly for people who've come from what I would call more traditional pagan paths. is probably the hardest thing to wrap your head around, which is how do we relate to them? And I always start here on the left-hand side here, which is heathens consider the gods direct relatives and ancestors. If you go back and you read the mythology, the Eddas and sagas surrounding the Norse gods, they actually have several where the Norse gods are actually people, and they are kings and queens and various other mostly regal entities on earth. And so we tend to consider them as relatives, revered relatives, but still relatives. And we tend to treat them as such. As a result of that, when you talk to any heathen about the types of interactions they tend to have with their divine beings, it is very different from what you will see with other kind of more traditional religions. We don't supplicate before our gods. We will not ask them for blessings just outright, and we'll talk more about that and a little bit what we mean by that. We realize they are powerful. They can do all sorts of interesting things in our lives, but they are a relative, and we treat them as such. Depending upon the nature of your relationship with this deity, as you develop a longer term relationship with them, you can call them on stuff. You can say, yeah, no, thank you. Stuff like that. We'll talk more about that. So that's the left one. Right-hand side is I tell people heathenism is a celebratory tradition. Everything we talk about, other than even when we talk about funereal traditions, is all about celebrating life and celebrating community. Everything we do is about getting, there was someone who had a phrase which is called sucking the marrow out of life. And when you look at heathens, that's truly what they do. They get every moment of every day, they do whatever they can to grab that energy and use it. And they just celebrate existence. And that's really one of the benefits of being on the path too, which is that in following these gods is you learn to, no matter how bad things are going, you know things are going to get better. You know there's always a path to get making things improve, and you celebrate life. There's one. Oh yeah, so as Raven said, there's been a lot about disparaging stuff about the depiction of the Northern European gods in the Marvel comics universe and how they're not, quote, accurate traditions. I will tell you one of the things that I talk about and my wife talks about as well is if you are tying yourself to the original literature at all, you do not realize that gods change. Gods change and adapt for the modern times, and they have to. And so to think that the Thor from 1,000 years ago is the same Thor for now is crazy. I mean, Thor has to change with time in order to adapt. We got another one which has the Red Pyramid collection. He has the Red Pyramid collection as created space for native. Oh, is that Rick Riordan, Adrian, that has got the space for native writers? Oh, that's interesting. I haven't written fiction yet. It's on my list. I've got a colleague of mine that writes thriller fiction for a living. And he's offered to sit down and talk with me about how do you transition from nonfiction to fiction, because he also wrote a bunch of nonfiction books. Okay, third one, I didn't want to change. Let's go back. Now we're going to go to the middle, and as you see here, we got someone showing their muscles, which is, I tell people the heathen gods help those who help themselves, and do not like weakness. Is that one of the things you learn when you start dealing with these gods is that if you show any sign of weakness with any of these gods, when dealing with them or kind of dealing with everything, they will eat you alive. Now, we're not talking about physical strength here, but you better be prepared to stand up and be your own being, is the way I tend to phrase it. You definitely want to establish yourself as someone of value when you start to dealing with these gods, because they need you as much as you need them. And so make sure that you don't go kind of as a wilted piece of spinach. I had some of that for lunch today. Go there with some strength behind you. Any questions? Comments, thoughts? Oh, there's Michael's saying there may be a Hindu series and a Native American series as well. Yeah, as Irene says, and she makes a good point, which is, yes, we're strong, but we're also very compassionate. It's that when we deal, and it's interesting because I would say heathens are very compassionate with others, and typically are not very compassionate with themselves. We tend to be our own worst critics. We'll see if Irene responds to that. Oh, and the gods too.
Yeah, I was more referring to the gods themselves, actually, and that I've flat out had.
Absolutely. Gods can absolutely be compassionate with you. No, there's no question about that. But I think if you come from a point of basically doing whatever they want and not asking any questions, that's when you get yourself into trouble. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, definitely. I just didn't want anyone to take the impression that, like, if you get the shit kicked out of you by life, that they'll just be like, fuck it, whatever, good luck, buddy.
Yeah.
That has not been my experience.
Yeah. Oh, and Raven said the gods are compassionate indeed, as long as you are willing to say, I screwed up. That's a good point. Oh, wow, that's a good one, Annie. I hadn't thought about that one. Was Adois et la, I can't pronounce it. Adois toi et la cietra, which is help yourself, then heaven will help you. That's an interesting one because I actually do a lecture on bind runes. And one of the things I say is there must be, if you want to change your life, one of the things that must happen is a precipitating event, which is you must do something yourself first before the gods will help you. So that's a good one. I'm going to have to grab that quote. I'm going to save this and use it later. That's a good. I didn't realize I was Catholic very briefly because I lived in Mexico. And when you're living in Mexico, you really don't have much choice. Okay, so you're starting to enter a relationship with the gods. And one of the things I tell people is when it comes to the Northern European gods, they have all sorts of wonderful gifts they're prepared to bestow upon you. What I tell people is that there's a rune. This is a rune over here called Geba. It literally translates to the gift. And it has a rule which says a gift demands a gift. So anytime when you're dealing with the Northern European gods, when they're going to give you something which is going to benefit you, be aware there's always a price. Now, we're not talking about necessarily a negative price, but there's always going to be a price. And by the way, that's true in human interaction as well, which is that when heathens deal with each other, we always expect that if I give you something, ultimately I'll get something in return, or something will happen. Sometimes it's pay it forward, but there's this kind of mutual transaction that always goes on. And it can be very complicated and very mellow, but there's this concept of whenever you're giving something, the universe should return it at some level. So when you're dealing with these gods, you want to be aware is when they offer you, however they may choose to offer you, some kind of spiritual or physical benefit, there's going to be a cost associated with that. Sometimes that is a negotiation that happens beforehand, particularly when you get into a closer relationship. Which now gets into the section of this lecture which people laugh at, which is I call bargaining with the gods. And this is a distinctly Northern European concept. There are probably some others, but I typically haven't seen this. But it is whenever you get into this situation where a god has something they're willing to give you or impart upon you, there's going to be a bargain. And my first rule is never take the first offer. So whenever you get into this, they're going to say, I want X, and I want Y, and I want Z, and I want the zoo, and I want a pony, and I want a unicorn. And you say, no, no, no. Let's get real about what I'm willing to give you out of my life. Now, let me give you a real world example of how this plays out. So as I was going down this heathen path, one of the things I was studying is runes, and people who know me, I have a pretty good reputation for rune reading. And that was a direct negotiation with Odin. When I was going down this path, I said, Odin, you got to help me out here. I'm trying to figure out how this thing goes out. He said, look, I can make you a great rune reader. No problem. And I said, okay. And it was through a series of dreams. And he said, I want this, and I want this, and I want this. And I said, no, you can't have that. You cannot have my life. And I had a series of dreams across a long period of time, and we came to a negotiation. And the negotiation is in years where there are pagan festivals, an important thing, is one day a year, I will sit down at 9 o'clock in the morning and I will do free readings from 9 o'clock in the morning until the last person has gotten the reading they want. That seemed like a reasonable bargain to me. It didn't seem like so bad. I have since learned much better about that. I have had 3 different years where that day I did more than 50 rune readings in a day. I started at 9 o'clock in the morning and I finished over after midnight without getting up from the table. I could have been a lot worse. The original bargains were much more worse. But be aware is that it is a negotiation. It's a negotiation you want to be aware of, which leads to the next lesson is beware of what you agree to. We talked about the lesson of Gabo. Sometimes a negotiation you will be involved in isn't just a benefit to you, but it'll be a benefit to community. Be careful about making the community commit to something. That's a pretty dangerous thing to go, but you can certainly sacrifice for the benefit of community. So that is my Gifts from the Gods lecture in 15 minutes or less. Any questions? Excellent point. African diaspora has the same set of rules. Yeah, and there was mead involved. There's always mead involved. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Where are we at time? Oh, we're in good shape. Okay. So you're entering into this relationship with a Northern European being. How do we go about honoring them? We don't talk about worship, interestingly. We tend not to think about the concept of worshiping the Northern European deities. We honor them. And I tell people that the best way you can honor the gods, and this is where, interesting, where the Marvel Comics universe stuff and the Rick Riordan stuff comes up, is remember. There's a very important quote from the Havamal, which is, he who is remembered lives. If you're on Facebook, well, all of you are on Facebook because you saw that, this listing. If you see heathens talk about people passing away, you will almost always see someone say, he who is remembered lives. And that's true for the gods as well, which is if we keep the gods in our mind and we write about them or whatever, that they become essentially living for us. That is how they stay as a part of our tradition. That's how we stay as a part of tradition with each other. We can also, before I get to this side, let's go back one. We can also write about them. So, and obviously Rick Riordan's a good example of that. J.R.R. Tolkien, a huge example of that. Particularly if you get his Siegfried book. Writing about them and publishing is another way as well. Teaching about them. A lot of heathens who speak well will become teachers just to kind of get the word out. We don't proselytize, but they get out and talk. We got another question. Yeah, the Egyptian version of this is, may your name live 1,000,000 years. Exactly right. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that as well. Okay. Kind of the last section I want to get into before I start taking questions is you started down that heathen path, you're developing a relationship with a Northern European god. How do you go about your daily practice? And I say there's really 3 things plus one. I don't have the 4th one here, which I'll talk about. The first one, and this is the easiest ritual, is called, and you can go out and do a search on the internet, and you can see these words, you'll find them, is the bloat. The bloat is the typical heathen a celebratory ritual. We celebrate a god or goddess. It runs typically relatively fast. They do them at Frederick CUUPS. Irene and Chris do them all the time. I've been to a couple of theirs, and they do a great job of them. I run a Free Spirit Gathering. You basically fill a horn or some kind of vessel of your choice with the beverage of your choice, and you offer a toast to the god or goddess, and you typically pass that around to everyone, and everyone makes a toast. It's really a ritual where I tell people it's all about developing relationships with the divine. It's your opportunity to have a close-up discussion with the divine, saying, look, here's what's going on in my life, help me out here, or hey, I'm having a great time, thank you for what's going on. So that's the blow. Typically they run a half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Unless it's a really big one. I ran a bloat about 10 years ago for 100 people. It took 2 hours. I'll never do that again. But that's a bloat. And you can go online and you can read about them. The next ritual is called a sumball. It is a ritual which involves a round of toasts. There are various structures of them. It's an interesting one because it's about us developing a relationship with the gods and goddesses. It's also a ritual which is about us developing relationships with each other. The first mention historically of sumball that we see is actually in Beowulf, where there's a reference to Beowulf sitting in sumball. He travels to a longhouse far away, and he sits in sumball with the householder. And we discovered that this sumball ritual, which is a series of toasts as well, is about transferring information about what's going on in people's lives. And the gods like to hear that. They like to know what's going on with us. So there's a sumball. Last one is profession. It has a variety of different levels and tiers, and everybody seems to have their own different, and there's a million different ways to spell sumball as well. I've seen S-Y-M-B-E-L, S-O-M-B-E-L. There's a million ways to spell that word because it's spelled differently in Norwegian. So getting back to profession, you can have everything from simply saying, I choose to follow a given god or goddess. You can have closer relationships. You'll see people refer to them, say, as Odin's son, or Thor's daughter, or Loki's son, or Loki's daughter. These are people who have a closer familial relationship. You can get very tied, and within heathen traditions, we do believe, just like with the African diaspora, in god marriages. You can elect, that was something I would be very careful about, but it is an option to become a spouse of a given god or goddess. I don't know very many people that have done that. I can probably count them in one hand that have taken that seriously. So those are 3 rituals. Again, they're all about celebration. And then the last one, which is not listed here, it's interesting because Irene brought this up actually on the CUUPS list several months ago, which is what I call daily practice. I was having a crisis of faith maybe 4 or 5 years ago where it wasn't that I didn't believe anymore, is that I wasn't spending any time kind of engendering the relationships. And a friend of mine from New York turned around and kicked my ass and said, daily devotionals. For the next 30 days, you must do a devotional to a god or goddess. And I started that, and now every morning when and I didn't stop. So every morning when I get up, I do a sunnah. I do a very quick sunnah prayer that I do, say thank you for the sun, yada, yada, yada. And then at the end of the night, I do a mani bloat, and then I've got a couple other rituals I do as well. Quick kind of opening and closing stuff. So daily ritual practice can become pretty important, particularly as you're developing a relationship with one of these gods or goddesses. If you say, look, for the next 30 days, I will offer a prayer to you, and I will write it down in a book, and I will not be the same prayer twice, which is what I did with one god, by the way. I wrote 30 prayers to one god. It's really good. So that's that. Okay. Let's see if I have anything else in my notes. On any of these things, when we're talking about dealing with the gods and negotiations and profession and all that kind of stuff, you're going to laugh, and I say, you don't physically have to draw up a contract, but you have to go through the process, which is you say, okay, what am I going to agree to? What are they going to give me? And you go through that process emotionally, and whatever visionary process you have, you go through that contractual process. That's a very important piece. So, Okay, that is my lecture. I went about 45 minutes, which is about what I expected. Questions, thoughts, comments, I'll now take questions on any heathen related topic, even non-heathen related topic. I'll take questions on anything. Everybody's so quiet. You can unmute yourself or you can put in the chat window. Yeah, as Irene says, and to be extra special clear, write it out and say it to bloat just in clip case. Absolutely correct. Whenever you're entering into one of these agreements with a god or goddess, definitely write it out and definitely do it in some ritualistic process. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so Raven put oathing promises at symbol public loads. That is a very good statement, which is you want to be very careful about making an oath or promise at either any kind of public ritual. If you're intending to do that, make sure you check with the officiant and make sure that it's okay to do such. Many officiants will not allow that. Now, there is a reason for that. It is not willy-nilly. One of the things within the heathen traditions in the concept of kind of destiny and all that kind of stuff is something called weird, W-Y-R-D, which is how all of our histories enmesh together. And one of the problems you have is that particularly if you're in a ritual and someone at that ritual makes an oath, you're now obligated to enforce that oath against them. So if they start to fail on that oath, you have to come and beat them up over it. So for a lot of public rituals, they will not allow that. But yes, definitely check with them. Thank you, Raven. Good one. David said, any other suggestions for developing daily practices? Yes. Keep it simple. Don't think about an hour-long mass for ritualistic practice. To give you an example of, with COVID, obviously death is a big issue right now. And I was kind of having an issue with how do I embrace Hela and embrace that particular situation that we're in right now in order to deal with it emotionally. One of the things when my father passed away that came to me was a set of his dog tags. He was in the US Navy during Vietnam. So I started that piece of my daily devotional practice as I have those dog tags sitting in a jewelry box, and I wake up in the morning, I sit up, I open up the jewelry box, I grab the dog tags, and I kiss them, and I give my dad 30 seconds of thought every morning. That's where I started that practice. So you start simple, and then as you find it more interesting or more helpful, you add stuff. Does that make sense, David? Okay, while we're waiting for a response from David, do heathen gods court mortals without the intention of marrying them? Oh, absolutely. Heathen gods do not have that. First of all, they are in fact polyamorous. They do have marriage, but they will certainly have stuff out of marriage. You're talking about court with in terms of just the intention of having a relationship with them? Sure, I'm not married to Odin. I'm not married to Freya. And I have very close relationships with both. I have a very close relationship with Hela, and I'm not married to her either. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Ragnan, any good sources? Oh, Ragnan. Adrian, let me see here. I'm pulling through my documents to see what I've got. I do not have Ragnan in my list. Adrian, I'm going to send you my email address. Ping me with that question and I'll do some research. Normally when we think about the Northern European Smith, I tend to think of Wayland. More questions. Hang on a second. Yeah, Jeff Bleem says they require in their group, they require oaths to be approved ahead of time. Elk Ridge Kindred does not allow spontaneous or unreviewed oaths. That's from Irene. Yeah, oaths you need to be careful about. That's an entire lecture in and of itself. And actually, I'm not the best one to do it. Eric Smith is. A friend of mine. God concerts are also a thing. No obligation or else just, yeah, you can have a close personal romantic relationship with a God. So Jenny asked the question, which is for those of us who don't really get messages, communications via dreams often, any suggestions on ways to negotiate with a god or goddess, so to speak? Yeah, absolutely. Write it down on paper and sacrifice it. I think that's a great way to do it. So if you want to enter a negotiation, write whatever you're interested in, take it on a piece of paper, either burn it sacrificially, or you can turn it into a bind rune. That's another option. I wouldn't turn it into a bind rune. I think sacrificing it ritually is probably your best bet. Does that make sense, Jenny? Yeah, so David said normally you jump in and then lose track and get sidetracked. That's the whole point of keeping things short. If you keep it to, say, one action and then a couple months later add a second action, that keeps you from getting sidetracked. Why do you think there are more heathen god consorts and spouses than, say, Hellenic, Kinetic, or Druid ones? Is there a reason why tons of people are drawn to Loki? Okay, so let's talk about those are kind of two different questions. If you compare heathenism versus the African diaspora, I would say that level of spousal level relationships are about the same in terms of percentages. I think one of the reasons for both, particularly for heathenism, is when we think about a god or goddess, they're a relative. They aren't human, but we treat them as human in a lot of ways. And because you have that kind of a relationship with them, having that spousal style relationship is a lot less problematic. That's question one. Question two, is there a reason why tons of people are drawn to Loki? I think there are a couple of reasons. I wouldn't say tons. When you look at the heathen population as a whole, not a whole lot of people are drawn to Loki. I think for a lot of non-heathens, they are. I think there are a couple of reasons why people are drawn to Loki. And some of them are good, and some of them are not so good. I think on the good side is Loki, I tend to refer to as the god of last resort. When you're on your last leg and have no way out, where things are just falling apart, Loki is a god you can go to and he will help you out always. That is the nature of who he is. So a lot of people, when they're on their last leg, he is a god that they can be drawn to. That's the good thing, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are drawn to Loki. I think the other side is considerably less attractive, which is I do see, and I will be honest about this, which is I see a lot of people who profess to be followers of Loki solely for the purpose of being able to engage in inappropriate social behavior. It is unfortunate, but true. Because of the tales behind the Locusena and all that kind of stuff and what Loki had done, they see I'm a follower of Loki as an excuse to engage in bad behavior, in my opinion. It's not everybody. I live with a Loki follower. I have friends that are Loki followers. One of my dearest friends is a Loki follower, and they're all very good people, but I do see that. Does that answer your question, Brielle?
Hey, Scott.
Yeah.
Just to drop one last thing into the conversation that's definitely true for the Frederick CUUPS community. Loki has also emerged as a queer allied deity, and a huge number of our queer friends and family follow Loki as a result, because of course he really does stand on their side, which is amazing.
That is a good, he will absolutely stand by their side. That is a very good point. More questions. Hang on a second here. We've been through that one. So we have Clark saying, I grew up in a traditional druidic setting and Ayerhood, in my patron days, but here recently I've been drawn to a much more shamanistic path in the northern traditions with Freyr and Freya. How do I reconcile the cultures? Do you have any suggestions? Okay, so this is a good one. So I'm going to tell a tale about this. How, if you were raised druidic or brought up druidic and then you're suddenly drawn to a heathen path, how do you reconcile them? The answer is there is no reconciliation to be made because there isn't a problem. And let me explain to you why I say that that's the issue. In the very, very first year I started doing rituals at Free Spirit Gathering, so this would have been like 1999 or 2000, I did a symbol. And we all got in the circle and we were doing our rounds of toasts. And the symbols that I run do not have a restriction on which deities you can profess to. I do not put that as a restriction. Some people do. And I respect them for that. I just don't, because I tend to be much more ecumenical. There was someone who, in fact, it was my wife, now that I think about it, offered a toast to the Morgan in the middle of ritual. And in this space, there were a couple of very young, relatively new pagans. They were like 21, 22, clearly were just starting their pagan path. And we get done with the ritual and I'm sitting there having the fun that you do after a sumball. And they come up and said, we have a question. I said, okay, tell me the question. They said, look, you had a whole bunch of druids in your circle. Your wife professed the Morgan, but you're a heathen. You guys don't get along. What's going on? And I said, look, here's the way to think about it in the modern context. When you think about the modern European pagan traditions, whether it be British traditional Wicca or the Native American paths or the Druidic paths or whatever paths you're talking about, the Druids and the heathens are closer to each other than other two groups in terms of belief. Druids and heathens, actually from a kind of a philosophical perspective, don't have a lot of differences with each other. So I don't think, Clark, that shift from Druidic to heathen is a big leap. The belief structures are fundamentally the same. The gods are very close to each other. So does that answer your question, Clark? I just don't think it's a big leap. Okay, while Clark is preparing his response to my very upfront and controversial answer, things on my altar keep me, yeah, good point. Amanda said, if you're having problems getting sidetracked, put stuff on your altar. Jeff Lean said, have you had any experience with interaction conflict with North cities and the Landvitier? So I have interacted with the Landvitier. I've never seen an interaction between the Norse deities and Landvitier. So I'm not aware of that particular situation. How do you deal with the Landvitier? It's actually very similar. So for those people who are not aware of what the Landvitier are spirits that have chosen to stay on the earth, typically for the purposes of protecting a piece of land. They're people who have spent their lives growing very closely tied to a piece of land, and then when they pass on, they don't pass on to one of the halls. They instead choose to stay on earth to protect that land. I think you see it less out here than you do, say, in the western parts of the United States. You see in the western parts of the United States all the time. It just seems to be the nature of things. And yeah, making offerings to them. I think the big difference, I would say, is that when you encounter a Landvitier, absolutely without question, respect the land of which they're protecting. You just don't cross that line. Does that answer your question, Jeff? Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. There's a Kemetic title called God's Wife, but it is really a title of high priestess for role nobles. Okay. Irene answered that question. I'm still going through questions. I'm just a little bit. Loki is also really good with, yep, LGBTQ community. Thanks a bunch. Yep, we got that one. I have been drawn to Sif. I can't find much on her. How do I connect with her when I don't know much about her? Sif is a bit of a challenge. Sif is Thor's wife. She is the one with the golden hair. The real tale that we know about Sif centers around Loki, and it's kind of a messy one because it's the tale of Loki stealing her hair and then Thor beating up Loki to make Loki go to the dwarves and get golden hair made for her. I think the answer to that question is there's a lot of depth to the Thor-Sif relationship. There are kind of two pieces to it. The first one is it's one of the few monogamous relationships that exist within the Northern European traditions. When you look at all the Northern European gods, they're all sleeping with each other, let's be honest about it. But Thor and Sif are monogamous, which brings that Thor-Sif tale to light, which is that tale when it talks about Loki stealing Sif's hair. It's not really about him stealing Sif's hair. It's about him sleeping with Sif. I would kind of start exploring that and see where it takes you. Does that make sense, Cheryl? Yeah, and as Irene says, she's very open to UPG. Okay, let me scroll back a little bit. Has Hiddleston's portrayal in Marvel Comics also had any influence? You're talking, so for Thor. I think the answer is Hiddleston's portrayal of Loki. I think the answer is yes. Now, the question of Loki is an interesting one, because if you had asked me 15, maybe 18 years ago, Loki within the heathen tradition, he was effectively the equivalent of a satanic god within the heathen tradition. Literally, he was the equivalent of Satan. That has tempered itself significantly over the last 20 years. Now, I think that's part of the Marvel Comics universe. I think it's also just kind of the change of society that we've gone through and our tempering of perspectives. But if you go back and you read some of like the late 19th century and early 20th century translations of the Norse myths, it is very clear that Loki is just a really bad guy, and he has definitely come less problematic. I will say that. I'll use that phrase. So is the Marvel Loki anything? So Sarah says the Marvel Loki is nothing like the god Loki. One of the things about the god Loki, and by the way, it's not just true for him, but true for a lot of gods, is they tend to have many faces, and they will show some faces to some people and not to others. Irene and myself and Becky all have very close personal relationships with Odin and Freya. However, the nature of those relationships for each of us is very, very different. And so I think for some people, yeah, the god Loki and the Marvel Loki are not the same. I think for others, they are. Yeah, I would say definitely the Marvel Comics universe is a gateway drug. Most of these are comments. I'm looking for more questions. Oh, as Irene pointed out, there's also a standing theory that the lore was shaped through translation to mimic. There's no question. So Irene pointed out, she says that there's kind of this theory that the lore was shaped to mimic Christian view. There is absolutely no question that's true. So the primary texts, the sagas and Eddas, are translated by Snorri Sturluson. He was in fact a Catholic priest, and he did the kind of the translations that everybody kind of professes to. And I can point to one thing that is a heated debate within the heathen traditions, which shows you how true it is that the heathen lore has been shaped by Christianity. If you go to the Havamal, and you look at, the Voluspa, or the Voluspa, which has a tale of Ragnarok and the end of times, the very last sentence in the Havamal talks about the rebirth and the birth of the one God. I can't remember exactly what the phrase is, but they talk about the birth of the one God. He's supposed to be Balder, who's reborn, but it's clearly a reference to Christianity. That was clearly, when you go back and you look at the original language that was written, it was an add-on at the end. It was something that was added on at the end. Now, interestingly, this has caused an interesting debate in another area, which is in the runes. So when you look at the runes, it's of the alphabet, which we do divination for. It's also their alphabet. And they have a sequence, just like any alphabet, A through Z. And when you look at that order, it is a tale of the universe. It is basically the beginning to the end, if you get deeply involved in them. And because of this ad on the Havamal, there's a huge debate that goes on as to which of the last two runes, which of the last two runes, which is truly last. When you look at most of the major texts these days, they put Dagas at the end, which is called the Daybreak, which is about rebirth. However, when you talk to other people more steeped in the tradition, Dagas is not the last rune. Othala is the last rune, and Othala is the rune about family. So those last, so David, are you talking about those last two runes, or are you talking about the whole debate about the Havamal? Yeah, that whole debate over the last two runes centers around the debate in the Havamal over the last two stanzas. Okay, more questions. We got that one. We got that one. So 20 years ago, Loki was the Norse Satan. He isn't anymore. There are some people that still believe that, but for the most part, he's not in that category anymore. Starts to learn something new every day. Raven says, is a global pantheist, multiple pantheons work fine. Is that my wife, Raven? Yes, it is. Hi, wife. Are there any other questions? We got 24 minutes, folks. You got to ask questions. Hold it. We just got someone who came in. Wow, they're running late. Okay, so Thomas just came in. Thomas, we're now taking questions. My wife and I are 2 floors apart, so I'll wave up here. Hi, wife. She's up here. Oh, David asked a good question, which is, how can you tell whether life is bopping you or whether it's a deity, which is a very difficult question. It's actually, particularly when you get onto the vision side, it's much more problematic, because you also have to ask yourself the question as to whether or not you're suffering some kind of psychological condition which needs to be addressed, which is a fair question to ask. My reaction is if it's repeatedly, and if it seems to happen repeatedly, I'd start to look towards kind of Son of God things, and if it seems to have purpose. Does that answer your question, David? Okay, Frank said, can you speak a bit about the Hammerite and when it is appropriate to use them? Okay, so the Hammerite, which is basically where you take a hammer, you go to a side and you make the sign of a hammer, and then you go to the opposite side of a room and you make the other side of the hammer. When is it appropriate to use them? Well, I think it depends upon who you talk to. There are some heathens that will tell you that there's no historical basis for the Hammerite. They are absolutely correct. There's no historical basis for it, therefore it should never be done. That being set aside, the way I tend to think about the Hammerite is, and this is something I picked up from Lou Stead from Raven Kindred South, who was in the area for several years, it is the equivalent of ringing a bell. It is the call to ritual. So when you're looking to divide that we are just socializing to we're now in ritual, the Hammerite is a very effective approach to that. Having someone stand up and do all the consternations that involve a Hammerite is a really good way to kind of set that space. I tend to think of it like, in fact, interestingly, I went out and I bought a bell with runes engraved on it for the purposes of opening up ritual. So that's the way, anytime you're opening up ritual, I think it's fine. Does that answer your question? Are there specific offerings that work better for specific deities, or is it more of a relationship thing? I think the answer is that Any offering has to be something of value. Now, what that value is can vary greatly between people. I do think there are certain deities, in my opinion, that prefers some offerings more than others. Mead works for almost all of them. I mean, just as a simple one. But to give you an example, a good friend of ours did a Heimdall bloat. Heimdall is a watchman. He's the guardian of the Bifrost Bridge. He got in his head that he was going to do a bloat where he would offer a toast using coffee, which he did so, and then couldn't sleep for 3 days. Obviously, Heimdall really liked that particular beverage. So the answer is yes. I think if you do some research, different gods and goddesses like different things. In one of my books, the Viking Ritual book, I do include feasts and toasts, and it's interesting because in dealing with Thor, and I talk about, okay, if you're going to do an offering to Thor, if you're going to do a feast for Thor, what kinds of things should you serve? And I say, one of the things, and people laugh at this, I said, go out and get a classic American beer when dealing with Thor. He is kind of the biker of the crowd. I say something like Natty Boh, PBR. These are the kinds of things that is not necessarily that they taste good, but it is something that he has respect for because it has got that classic kind of human-made kind of thing about it. So yeah, definitely I would say some gods like some things more than others. Purpose being the underlying aspect. Yeah, I've heard that heathenry focuses more on the divine masculine than the divine feminine. That is absolutely, so Brielle said that heathenry focuses on the divine masculine more than the divine feminine. Absolutely incorrect. I would say that heathenry focuses more on the divine masculine than other traditions do. They are not a feminine-dominated tradition, but they are parallel to each other. I think they are the most balanced, and I'll probably get beat up over that by somebody. Frigga, gotta remember right goddess, is keeper of the keys. She is the holder of the house. Remember, we're talking about a tradition where men would go out for 6 or 8 months out of the year hunting and fishing and warring, and women ran society. I honestly think that if you're talking about true egalitarianism in its classic sense, heathenism offers the best egalitarian model that you can see. Jenny asked the question, which is, do I have any thoughts on working with Odin and Loki together? They are brothers. In fact, one of the rules in heathenry is whenever Odin gets a toast, Loki gets one as well. So technically, whenever you're like at a assemble and someone does an Odin toast, someone else is supposed to do a Loki toast. I think they're fine to work together. I think there's no issue with that. You want to be aware that they're very different energies, and the way you deal with them are very different from each other. And here's what you're going to find funny. The one I would be most careful of would be Odin. Loki may be the trickster, but Odin is the con man, and I can get away with saying that. Odin will absolutely try to get you into doing stuff that you don't want to do. So I think dealing with both of them is fine. If I'm concerned about dealing with any of them, I think Loki is, I wouldn't necessarily say straightforward, but certainly less problematic than Odin. So someone said, given that we have many gender-bending deities in the heathen gods, I don't know if we assume divine gender at all. Well, I mean, we do have gender in a sense because we do have Odin married to Frigga, and we have Odin and Frey in a relationship. Though their concept of gender is very weird. I don't try to get too involved in their own interpersonal relationships with gods. I don't think that's our business. I think that the fact that Freyr and Frey, who are brother and sister, slept with each other is a little bit problematic, but again, not my business, not my problem. Hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. Gods versus the Jotun. Jeff Bleem asked the question, are they approachable in the same way? Should they all be dealt with? And if so, what cautions would you advise when approaching the Jotun? So the Jotun, again, we're going to get into this. If you asked me this question 20 or 30 years ago, the answer would have been very different. The Jotun are the forces of nature. They ultimately, in the end times, go to war with the traditional Norse gods, and that's what causes destruction. The Jotun, because they're forces of nature, tend to be it's much harder to develop relationships with them. They tend to be much more I wouldn't say emotionally driven, but they don't have kind of that linguistic skill we think about in tying with the Norse gods. I think that's one of the challenges with them. But on the other side, you have to remember is that the interpersonal relationships and kind of mixing of bloods between Jotun and the Aesir is all over the place. I mean, Loki is technically Jotun. Skadi is technically Jotun. Hela is technically Jotun. There are a lot of Jotuns who are also Aesir. So I think in general, when you're talking about approaching the Jotun, the non-Aesir Jotun is the way I would phrase them, is that they tend to be much more fundamental elemental forces, and you have to deal with them as such. Does that answer your question, Jeff? Coffee good for Odin. Have not tried that. Iduna and hard cider is an excellent one. Bragi, cider's wife. Yep, good choice. Loki with cheap whiskey and old bars. These are good comments. Divine gender is variable, like persons. If a defines something. Yeah, honoring their wishes is the good way to go. A lot of the lore is missing. Irene's absolutely correct. In terms of traditions, heathenism has a lot of lore missing. It is not the worst. Rob Schreier follows Erglaway. Is that what you pronounce it? And their entire tradition, it's a Pennsylvania Dutch German tradition. And most of their tradition has been completely wiped out for political and religious reasons. Loki and Odin, the two-man con. Good way to describe it. That is correct. According to lore, Odin will not drink in a hall where Loki is not welcome. That is absolutely correct. If you're looking for a so David, are you looking for a gatekeeper in the Papa Legba sense or in the Guardian sense? Yeah, that's why I asked that question. Wow. I don't know. I'm going to ask Irene. I don't so when I think about kind of someone who's looking for a Papa Legba parallel, I don't think Heimdall's the right one. Would you agree, Irene?
Yeah, I do. That was when I thought that David meant a gatekeeper, like a guardian. In terms of a gateway drug, which I think is more what we're looking at, there are a few possibilities. We don't have an exact allegory, do we? We don't. I mean, Odin's got a lot of Legba qualities to him, so that's close.
Who is the guardian that sits at the entrance to hell?
The giantess?
Giantess.
Yeah. Moldgud. Moldgud.
Moldgud would be your best Legba parallel.
I would actually disagree. I would say that Heimdall is actually still an agent. I mean, Moldgud is good and is not an invalid answer, but Heimdall is also not an invalid answer because he watches all the worlds, and he is actually a good one to knock on the door with and say, hey, can you show me around?
That's true too.
Can I just ask Irene to spell the name of the god or goddess that she just said?
Moldgud?
Yes, that name. Oh, thank you, because it's just impossible for some of us. Thanks.
Hang on a second. Yeah, that's it. Mothgud. Yes. Yeah, she is a giantess that sits at the gate to hell, and everybody has to pass through her in order to move into hell, which is an entirely different thing. Personal question. I've been talking to Bragi since day one about my writing career. Is there anyone else that might be useful to talk to about that? I think the answer is it depends upon what you're writing about. If you're writing about fiction, classic fiction, I think Bragi is definitely the way to go. if you're talking about something else, then you want to look for the god that most affiliates with whatever you're writing about. You had mentioned something earlier along the lines of people are drawn to Loki as a last resort god, like when they're at their lowest, that Loki would help, no questions asked. Is it possible the lowness people are feeling during the current pandemic is drawing some people? Yeah, I think they're certainly right. So they're talking about the current pandemic and the situation. That's why people are being drawn to Loki. Yeah, I definitely think that's something to be considered, which is we have certainly hit an age hit a point where we're feeling completely hopeless. And that's the way I tend to think about when you go to Loki is when you're just when you're out of luck, when you have no idea how to fix the problem, Loki is the one you go to. And I think you're right. I think the current pandemic may be that situation.
Loki is also the one you go to when you don't trust the authority.
Yeah, that's
if you don't think the authority has your best interest at heart, and at this time the authority is the people sitting in seats of power in Washington, if you don't feel like the authorities have your best interest in heart, you're going to go to the anti-authority, which Loki represents, the anti-authority, to get that empowerment back.
Absolutely. So Frank asked the question, which is, delving deeper into the Guardian question, who would be the best option for exorcists? So I'm going to set aside the word exorcism because that has a very Catholic color to it. I'm going to say, for a Guardian who is looking to extricate someone from a possession, that's a safer set of terms to use. I think you've got to go to the three classic ones who kind of govern that region, which is Odin, Freya, and Hel. I think they're the ones I would kind of go to start. There would probably be some others. It depends upon the nature of the possession. I mean, you could certainly go to Aer, the goddess of healing. In some cases, that might be where you're going, but I would definitely start thinking about Odin, Freya, and Hel. And honestly, of the three, I'd go to Freya first. Okay, Frank, does that answer your question? Wow, these are good questions. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Oh, I've got more slides. I forgot about these. Are there any practice for Hel which you would recommend? Yes. I think a good Hel practice involves ancestor worship or ancestor devotionals. Setting up an ancestor altar, daily devotionals to ancestors. I think that's the fundamental building block for a Hel relationship with Hel. Does that answer your question, David? Brielle says they're a Greek polytheist, but I'm kind of drawn to Hel because I can't shake the feeling that she has a fascinating relationship with my matron. Hel's a very interesting deity to deal with because she's very comforting, in my opinion. I mean, when you see the portrayals of her, that's very, very chilling, but ultimately she ends up being very comforting. Yeah, you can fall. Yeah, as Irene says, you can fall into a relationship with Hel sideways by doing ancestral practices. Thomas Dennis asked the question, are there any books that you can recommend other than my books? It depends upon what you're looking for in terms of the heathen practices. I think Diana Paxton's books are all good. I've got books that have written. Aaron Lael has good books that have been written. I think they're all very good. Typically, honestly, if you go on Amazon and you do a search on heathen stuff and you look at the reviews, you'll see what's good and what's bad because the heathens who see bad stuff will talk about it. No, no, absolutely. Any kind of devotional or study of a god or goddess is always going to give you a deeper understanding of who they are. And I think Hel is really, in some respects, present company accepted, really misunderstood. Because hell has HEL, which we tend to put that Christian overlay on, and it's a very different concept. I think people don't understand. Hell's very comforting, and is there basically to take care of people in a pretty bad time. Let's face it, death is a bad time. Irene loves hell. She is awesome. One of the things I will tell people, I forgot about these couple more slides, is when dealing with the Norse gods, one of the things we always want to keep at the forefront is we are our deeds. Another famous quote. The other one is speak useful words and be silent. But the idea is the gods respect action, not thought. So taking thought and converting it to action is an important part of developing a relationship with them. I'm going to leave that there while I answer more questions. Other questions? Wow, I didn't think we'd go an hour and a half. I was so wrong. I'm going to take that and screenshot that, Irene. Okay, we're coming up on the end. Last call for questions. I have a website, www.modernheathen.com. It has not been updated as much as it should be. I'm really bad about it lately. COVID has kind of sucked my brain away. You can go on Amazon and search my name, Scott Monkern, and you can find my books. I'm on Facebook, and you can search on Scott Monkern. There are only 2 Scott Monkerns on Facebook. One of them is a Pennsylvania State Trooper. That would not be me. But I'll take friendship requests from almost anybody. Other than that, I got to do the shameless pitch, which is that, I got one more. First one is that if you like me to speak, I have a whole bunch of heathen-related and non-heathen-related topics that I'm willing to lecture on. I can obviously do them via Zoom with no problem. Just ping me and say, we'd really like you to come and talk about this kind of topic. Or if you want to know what topics I'll talk about, I can send you that as well. And I can do it on a moment's notice. The Frederick CUUPS Church, Frederick CUUPS, has been amazing. I've been dealing with them now for about 4 or 5 years, and Irene and her group with 4 or 5 years. They are amazing. They've let me merchant there. They've let me do rituals there, and heathen rituals are always fun. They let me do lectures there. They let me fill a room way beyond capacity one year. We don't want to talk to the fire people about that. So do take the time to give them some money. If it's only $1, if it's only $5, that's fine. Even if it's 50 cents goes fine. Because every person who contributes, I mean, I know I sound like public television. Every person who contributes counts, but that's true. So
this is very private television, Scott. And the instructions for the donation are in the post for this listing, for this event. Yep. And the suggested donation for tonight's event is $10 if you are able to do so. And if you are not, we're really just glad that you joined us tonight.
Yeah. This has been terrific. These are really good comments, really good questions. I love this lecture. It's always very fun. Last call for questions before we call it quits.
Frank Stormcatcher has his hand up.
Okay.
Oh, and then there's one other question I have to answer after Frank asks his question.
Oh, well, you may want to wait on this one. Given that we have so much of the lore that is lost to us, could you address the idea of kennings in terms of God names? Because I know we run into a situation where either we think we're not finding any lore about a particular deity, or we think we have 5 deities that are actually one deity called different kennings.
Yeah. So for people who aren't familiar with the word kennings, kennings are alternative names for a god or goddess. It's a big part of the heathen tradition where, like, you talk about Odin, Old One Eye, the Wanderer, and then the one I use, which is One-Eyed Con Man, which is a great one for him. These kennings are alternative names. I think you have to look at, so I think there's a difference between a kenning which is descriptive, like the Wanderer, and just a different name, which is a different god. So I would never conflate Freya or Frigga. Some people will try to do that, and the answer is no. They're two different divine beings, and there's no question in my mind about that. And the reason why I say that is, first of all, they have two very different paths, and second of all, those are two very distinct names that one of them is not a kenning of the other. Does that make sense? So if it's a descriptive kenning, I'd say, yeah, that may be part of them. If it's just another name, I'd say, yeah, no, it's another god or goddess. Now, you got to be aware that spellings change across time, and we're aware of that. But in general, I'm like, there's a big difference between an alternative kenning and a god or a goddess with a different name. Now, the question which Bella asked at the beginning, which I did not forget, when I originally offered this, was teaching heathenism, the class I offered was called Introduction to Asatru. And people say, well, why do you call it heathenism now? And it has to do with kind of the nature of the way kind of the religion has progressed. 20 years ago, anybody who followed a Northern European path was called Asatru. They were just given that general label. Asatru has now grown to become a very specific set of practices and a very specific set of beliefs within the Northern European traditions, some of which I follow and some of which I don't. So I do not profess to be Asatru anymore. Heathenism is a broad, general term for people who tend to be on a class, what I would call a classic Northern European path, which means we all tend to run the same set of rituals. We may have some differences of opinion. We tend to worship all the same set of gods for the most part, but we all tend to be kind of in a similar direction. So I would say heathenism is like Christianity versus Asatru, which would be like Catholic. Does that make sense? So yeah, and you will find also, I actually have a, for Cherry Hill Seminary, I teach a Northern European pagan traditions class, which is 8 weeks long, and we suss out all the different words and what they mean. Because there are a whole bunch of them, and I'm always coming up with new ones, and they're all slightly different. So it's kind of an interesting minefield you have to step your way through. But heathen is pretty sufficiently generic. If you identify as heathen, you will not offend anybody. Bella's talking, but is muted.
Well, what I was going to say is, yeah, a lot of people would be offended, but just not in this room.
Well, yeah. Hold on. Do we have another question? Oh, that's a click donate. Last call for questions. Okay, I'm going to shut off the recorder, and I will get that.